All right, so let's set the stage here because we're really looking at a tangled mix of behavior, evidence, and strategy involving Burke Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and John Ramsey, and the way their words and actions might have shaped the direction of the investigation. The key focus here is how certain lines of inquiry were fiercely guarded against, particularly anything that hinted at Burke's involvement, while other paths, often involving people with barely a thread of connection, were enthusiastically pushed forward. That contrast alone tells us a lot about where the emotional and strategic walls were built. Maybe this was purely protective parenting. Maybe it was something deeper, but either way, the pattern is too distinct to ignore. And if we look closer, what's really curious is that this selectivity wasn't random. It seems almost organized, like there was an internal hierarchy of who gets shielded and who gets thrown under the bus, or at least into the line of police questioning. That opens up the bigger question of intent. Were these moves reactive, coming from a place of fear and stress, or were they calculated steps to shape the investigation's focus? We might find that the answer lies somewhere in the middle, where instinctive self-preservation meets deliberate redirection. On top of that, we have to acknowledge the role of contradictions, both in statements and in behavior. When John says one thing, Patsy says another, and Burke says something else entirely, those aren't just differences in memory, they're competing narratives. In an investigation like this, that kind of inconsistency isn't just noise, it's a signal that something in the story's structure is being bent or reshaped. And what's also interesting is that these contradictions often land right at the points where the household's internal story bumps against forensic facts. Then there's the way physical evidence folds into this dynamic. The pineapple bowl, the glass of tea, the fibers, the bat. These aren't just static objects, they're touch points in a timeline, and the fingerprints or fibers found on them tell us about presence, sequence, and proximity. In layman's terms, it's not just who touched what, but who touched what, when, and in what context. And when the answers to those questions keep looping back to the same set of people, it's hard not to think about what that says for the bigger picture. So as we move into the analysis, we're really going to look at how all these threads, protective behaviors, outsider targeting, narrative contradictions, and evidence connections don't just exist side by side, but seem to weave together into a functional system. And whether that system was consciously built or just emerged out of instinct, the effect is the same. It steers the investigation away from certain people and into places where it's far less likely to find what it's looking for. That's where our deeper dive begins. 1. Discussions regarding interviews, cooperation, and public stance. In their desire to actively participate in solving the crime, both John and Patsy repeatedly communicated their frustration and desire for a more productive dialogue with authorities. In John Ramsey's 1998 interview, he plainly stated that we, referring to himself and Patsy, were very frustrated that we couldn't seem to get off the dime with a serious investigation with good communication, and that they had asked Pat to communicate with the district attorney's office that we were here, we would meet with them right now if they wanted to. This clearly articulates a joint decision to engage with the prosecution. John further emphasized their shared sentiment that it's been very frustrating for us as they dealt with pettiness instead of a serious investigation, particularly after police initially refused to release JonBenet's body for burial unless they submitted to interrogation. Patsy Ramsey, in her April 1997 interview, echoed this desire for cooperation, stating she appreciated comments of wanting to work with us, and in her June 1998 interview, she conveyed that she had prayed for this day for a year and a half to be working hand in hand with authorities. Their attorneys also played a crucial role in these discussions. John's lawyer, Brian Morgan, explained that their offers to Commander Becker to talk were essentially rejected, a point John corroborated as not what John had in mind. This shows a shared understanding of the hurdles to cooperation. Their public statements were also a subject of internal discussion or a result of their shared strategy. John, reflecting on their May 1997 interview with local media, explained, "We just said, look, we've been so criticized for not cooperating, which was ridiculous, because we'd happily agreed to do anything that we were asked." In his book, The Death of Innocence, John further elaborated on their joint CNN interview. Patsy and I stated that now that JonBenet was properly laid to rest, we wanted to return to Boulder and help with the investigation. The police had leaked false information that we were not cooperating and had refused to be interviewed. Our comments would have helped refute those leaks. He also acknowledged observing public criticism of Patsy for being too emotional and himself for not being emotional enough during that interview, which undoubtedly would have been a shared point of reflection. While Patsy admitted that John was more involved in directing their private investigation and knowing its trajectory, she confirmed, "He shares some of it with me, though not all of it." She was aware that John spoke frequently with their investigator, Ollie. Patsy also confirmed that either she or John had to approve major expenditures for their investigation, demonstrating a joint understanding and decision-making about the resources committed. Patsy's statement that they met with our attorney before her June 1998 interview also confirms a joint preparation for questioning. Okay, so let's first think about this idea of John's personality and his natural inclination toward deep involvement in the investigation. This isn't someone who passively sits back while others take the lead. This is a man who appears to thrive on details, structure, and a sense of control. When you have that kind of personality, it's not surprising that he would dive headfirst into every element of the case, looking for the smallest inconsistency or the slightest lead. From a criminological standpoint, we know that high control personalities often try to manage not only the narrative, but also the very process of investigation itself. This can serve two purposes. First, to stay informed, and second, to subtly influence the way the investigation unfolds without it looking overtly like interference. And when we consider the psychology behind this, it's worth noting that highly analytical individuals often have difficulty letting go of a process that directly involves them. In forensic psychology, there's a concept that the person closest to a high-stakes situation will naturally want to position themselves as the one in the know, because relinquishing that control feels like inviting chaos. In John's case, nitpicking every detail down to the nitty-gritty could be seen as simply his way of coping with the uncertainty. But what's also interesting here is that such hyper-involvement can cross into the territory of shaping the evidence flow, where information is not only received, but filtered, framed, and even subtly directed. From a technical point of view, this level of involvement also raises questions about the chain of information. In investigative work, chain of custody applies not only to physical evidence, but to narrative evidence, meaning the stories, timelines, and explanations being built around the facts. If a person with a vested interest in the outcome has significant influence over how those narratives are shaped, it can create a subtle but powerful distortion in the case's trajectory. Layman's terms, if you're too involved in telling the story, you might start editing it, even unconsciously. We also have to think about the physiological underpinnings of this constant high alert engagement. When someone is deeply invested in a crisis, their sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, is often activated for long stretches of time. That kind of heightened state can make people hypervigilant, laser-focused on details, and ready to spot inconsistencies. But it can also cause tunnel vision, where they fixate on certain elements and ignore others that don't fit their preferred view. That's important because it suggests that John's nitpicking might not be entirely about solving the crime. It could also be about maintaining a psychological sense of control. What's funny in a way is that this kind of detail-driven behavior can be interpreted in two opposite ways depending on who's looking at it. From a friendly perspective, it's seen as dedication, thoroughness, and a refusal to leave any stone unturned. From a suspicious perspective, it's seen as overcompensation, someone who needs to insert themselves everywhere to keep an eye on the narrative. This duality is why in criminal profiling, we always have to be careful about drawing conclusions based on behavior alone. The same action can have multiple interpretations. Now, if we take a philosophical point from criminology, this kind of behavior touches on what's called positional advantage. In plain language, it's the idea that whoever controls the flow of information and has the best grasp of the details will always be in a stronger position to influence outcomes. Whether that influence is benign or malicious is another question entirely, but the position itself is powerful. And in this case, John's tendency to get into the weeds of the investigation could be granting him that positional advantage without anyone explicitly granting it to him. There's also the matter of forensic framing, how people inside a case frame events, details, and motives in a way that subtly shifts suspicion away from themselves or their interests. In the public eye, this can be as simple as emphasizing certain details in interviews while downplaying others. Within the investigation, it could mean pointing the police towards some leads and away from others, not by lying outright, but by controlling the depth and tone of the conversation. It's like steering without grabbing the wheel. And finally, from the standpoint of getting inside the mind of the killer, we have to consider whether the perpetrator, if it were someone inside the home, might have anticipated exactly this kind of controlling involvement. A killer who knows their target's psychological tendencies could exploit them, crafting a scenario in which that person's natural desire to take charge of details inadvertently disrupts or complicates the investigation. In other words, the very traits that make John appear on top of things could also make him predictable and thus easier to manipulate. And we can continue to think about the way John and Patsy seem to control the flow of information, which takes us into this second point about selective sharing and the you need me more than I need you dynamic. In legal strategy, this is a classic positioning move. It keeps the upper hand by limiting the other party's access to what they want or need. The irony here is that while it looks defensive on the surface, it can actually be offensive in practice. By only giving bits and pieces, they could control not just the pace of the investigation, but also the narrative arc of suspicion and focus. What's also worth noting is that this kind of withholding isn't always about hiding guilt. It can also be about preserving autonomy. Psychologically, people who feel cornered or pressured tend to assert control over something, and in this case, that something is the flow of information. The effect is that law enforcement ends up in a reactive position, constantly trying to extract cooperation, which puts them one step behind. And in forensic criminology, being one step behind is where mistakes happen. The other interesting part here is that this selective sharing creates a psychological game. It's not just about facts, it's about power and perception. If the police believe they're being stonewalled, they may push harder in one direction and neglect another, which could unintentionally benefit the person doing the stonewalling. On the flip side, if law enforcement backs off to maintain a working relationship, they risk losing valuable investigative momentum. From a technical perspective, controlling the flow of information also means controlling the evidentiary timeline. The evidentiary timeline isn't just the chronological sequence of events, it's also the order in which investigators learn about those events. If you can rearrange when and how they learn something, you can affect their interpretation of it. In layman's terms, if you give someone the ending of the story before the middle, they'll understand it differently than if they had gotten the story in order. And from a physiological and behavioral standpoint, when someone knows they hold critical pieces of information, it triggers a reward mechanism in the brain. This sense of having leverage can be addictive in high-stakes situations, and it can subtly influence how they decide when to release information. This means the withholding might not always be strategic in the rational sense. It could also be emotionally gratifying for the person doing it. The philosophical side of this ties into the concept of informational asymmetry, which in criminology and negotiation theory refers to situations where one party has more or better information than the other. Whoever has the asymmetry has an inherent advantage. In an investigation, this advantage can be used to deflect suspicion, stall certain lines of questioning, or bait investigators into focusing on red herrings. In terms of forensic framing, selective sharing allows the storyteller to choose which elements to highlight, which to obscure, and which to omit entirely. Even subtle differences, like describing someone's behavior as upset rather than hysterical, can shift perception in meaningful ways. And if you apply that to the ransom note, to timelines, or to interpersonal accounts, it becomes a powerful tool for influence. And from the killer's perspective, if we're thinking hypothetically here, a perpetrator who is inside this web of controlled information benefits enormously if the family is already in the habit of managing and limiting details. The less open the flow of facts, the easier it is to bury certain truths in plain sight, because everyone has already accepted that not all information is being freely shared. Along the same lines, we have to examine this third point about their contradictory behavior, being hostile one moment and friendly the next, almost as if toggling between two emotional modes to suit the circumstance. This isn't just casual mood fluctuation. This can be seen as a calculated social tactic. When someone can switch between aggression and charm, they keep the other party off balance, which is a well-documented negotiation and interrogation strategy. In psychological terms, this tactic works because humans are wired to seek relational consistency. When someone alternates between coldness and warmth, it creates cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable mental state that the brain naturally wants to resolve. Often, that resolution involves giving the inconsistent person what they want just to stabilize the relationship. If this was at play here, it means they could leverage emotional pressure to get access to information or concessions. From a criminological perspective, this back and forth between hostility and friendliness can also function as a defense mechanism. If the friendly approach doesn't yield results, they can switch to hostility to intimidate or shut down certain lines of questioning. Conversely, if hostility creates too much tension, they can retreat into friendliness to repair the working relationship. It's a push-pull dynamic that allows for flexibility in handling investigators. Now, the Fleet White example becomes key here. Calling him over right after a police interview to get his account isn't just curiosity, it's about controlling secondhand narratives. If they can get someone else's fresh account before it's filtered by Time or police reports, they can incorporate it into their own version of events, or at least be prepared to counter it. That's not just social maneuvering, that's intelligence gathering. Technically, this behavior overlaps with what's called source monitoring in forensic interviewing, the process of identifying where a piece of information came from and how reliable it is. By pulling in Fleet White so quickly, they essentially cut out the police as the intermediary, giving themselves first access to the raw version of events. In layman's terms, they wanted the unedited footage before the director made cuts. Physiologically, this kind of high-speed information chasing suggests a heightened arousal state, possibly adrenaline-driven, where quick access to intel feels urgent and necessary. This can happen when someone feels under threat and believes that knowledge is their best defense. But, again, that urgency can also serve an offensive role, allowing them to counter narratives before they fully form. From the philosophical side, this toggle between friendliness and aggression mirrors certain behavioral models in predator-prey dynamics, where a predator might feign passivity or openness to lure trust, then strike with aggression when advantageous. If we imagine the killer watching this unfold, they might see these shifts as either a smokescreen or a dangerous tell, depending on whether they're inside the circle or outside it. And if we truly get into the mind of the killer, this entire pattern, John's deep involvement, their control of information, and the emotional push-pull could either be part of the killer's own behavioral playbook or exactly the kind of environment they hope to exploit. If the environment is already primed for manipulation, a skilled offender wouldn't need to create chaos. They just need to ride the currents already moving in their favor. 2. Discussions about specific evidence. The presence of undigested pineapple in JonBenet's stomach became a contentious point of evidence, and the Ramseys' discussions about it are particularly illuminating. In his June 1998 interview, when asked by Lou Smith if he had discussed that at all or tried to find out what the reason for the pineapple in the bowl was, "Last night," John Ramsey directly replied, "Last night? I tell Patsy that I think I mentioned that I was puzzled by the bowl, the large bowl of what appeared to be pineapple with a big serving spoon in it. It didn't register with her. She said, 'I hope they show you a picture.'" This is a clear, explicit confirmation of a recent discussion between them about this specific piece of evidence. John went on to directly quote Patsy to his attorney, Brian Morgan, stating, "I know I didn't feed her pineapple. I know Patsy didn't feed her pineapple because she said she didn't." This affirms Patsy's direct communication of her denial to John. Both John and Patsy were resolute that JonBenet was sound asleep when she came home and would not have eaten after that, believing the pineapple had to be from the Whites or prior to that. Patsy's recollection of the pineapple, however, presents a nuanced difference. In her August 2000 interview, she stated she did not remember a specific discussion with John about the pineapple. She did recall John mentioning seeing a bowl of pineapple and generally hearing that pineapple was found in JonBenet's stomach, perhaps from TV. Despite this minor divergence in recall, her independent descriptions of the pineapple incident align with John's concerns about its unusual presentation. Patsy asserted, "I would never put a spoon that big in a bowl like that, ... This looks weird to me, a bowl with a huge spoon like that with pineapple in it." She also confirmed she bought fresh, not canned, pineapple. When confronted with the fact that fingerprints on the bowl belonged to either her or John, Patsy maintained, "I did not put the bowl there. Okay, I did not put the ball there. I would not do this, said it." She also stated that the Whites had told us that they did not serve her pineapple. Beyond the pineapple, other evidence points to shared discussions. John Ramsey explicitly recalled a discussion with Patsy about a red nightgown found in the wine cellar, clarifying that Patsy didn't recognize it. Both were aware of the high-tech boot print found at the scene, with John noting we looked and thought about it, and Patsy stating she probably heard about it from John. John also recounted giving Linda Arndt a notepad with Patsy's grocery list for handwriting samples on December 26, indicating his access to and knowledge of Patsy's personal items for investigative purposes. Regarding the autopsy findings, John admitted he had seen very little of the autopsy report and found it hard to discuss with her accidentally sensitive details like the fracture or abrasions, suggesting a conscious effort on his part to shield Patsy from the most graphic information. Patsy confirmed she had not received the report directly either. However, Patsy did state she had heard that the night she was killed that she may have been SMEX manipulated, information she likely received from John or their legal team. And of course, I'm changing some wording for you too. So let's first think about what it really means when someone resists being separated for questioning. In any standard investigation, especially in potential homicide cases, police separate witnesses or family members to get uncontaminated statements. This isn't some odd targeted attack. It's an established best practice grounded in both criminology and cognitive psychology. The reasoning is simple. Once two people have had a chance to talk, consciously or unconsciously, their versions of events start to align, not necessarily because they're conspiring, but because human memory is malleable and people naturally want to get the story straight. Now, in a case where the Ramseys are adamant about staying together, that's not just a casual preference, it's a choice that runs directly against the grain of investigative procedure, which invites us to ask why. When you consider the psychology here, there's a subtle power dynamic at play. Staying together in an interview scenario means preserving a shared narrative, which in turn means each person is less vulnerable to being contradicted in real time. This could also act as an emotional buffer. People often feel more confident or combative when supported by someone they trust. From a purely behavioral science standpoint, resisting separation signals a desire to manage the flow of information, and it suggests a perceived risk in individual exposure, meaning that even if unintentionally, they are protecting themselves from discrepancies that might surface under solo questioning. There's also an element of perceived control that comes into this. In high-stress, high-profile cases, suspects or even just involved parties sometimes believe they can manage the investigation better than the investigators themselves. Philosophically, this ties into the criminological concept of narrative management, where a subject attempts to influence not only the facts presented, but the manner in which those facts are delivered. By refusing to be separated, they keep the reins on the emotional tone, the pacing, and the sequence in which details come out. Now, in fairness, one could argue that their resistance could be framed as a defensive response born out of mistrust. They may have seen the police as adversarial and therefore believed that separation was simply a tactic to exploit their vulnerability. This mindset isn't uncommon in wealthy or high-status suspects who are used to controlling their own environment. Psychologically, they may have felt like they were walking into a negotiation rather than participating in a truth-finding mission. The irony here is that this mistrust, whether justified or not, ends up looking like obstruction to outside observers. We also can't ignore the optics of it. In the court of public opinion, resisting something as standard as separate questioning appears suspicious, regardless of the stated reasoning. This is where forensic framing comes in, meaning the perception of actions is often as important as the actions themselves in shaping investigative theories. A refusal might not be proof of guilt, but it can shift the framing of the case towards suspicion simply because it defies expected cooperation patterns. There's a physiological layer here too. People under acute stress sometimes display an instinctive clustering behavior, staying close to familiar allies. It's an evolutionary safety response, rooted in our need for social bonds in dangerous situations. However, in a police setting, that same survival instinct collides with procedural necessity, and what feels natural to the subject reads as evasive to the investigator. Interestingly, if we put ourselves inside the mind of a potential killer who is also a family member, the need to stay physically close to an accomplice or co-covering party isn't just about emotional comfort. It's about maintaining alignment in real time. Eye contact, subtle cues, and even physical presence can serve as reinforcement to stick to the plan. It's less about fear of the police and more about fear of the partner in the room accidentally veering off script. And finally, philosophically speaking, the refusal to be separated becomes symbolic. It's a stand against the system's rules and an assertion of self-determined boundaries. In criminology, this is seen as a form of resistance behavior, where the subject redefines the investigative dynamic on their own terms. Whether that's rooted in guilt, fear, arrogance, or simply mistrust is where interpretation and debate begins. And we can continue to think about the question that naturally follows: if nothing happened, why would separation be an issue at all? This is one of those points where deductive reasoning kicks in hard. If each party's recollection is honest and independent, then being questioned separately should pose no risk. It should, in fact, produce cleaner, more consistent results. The logic here is straightforward. Truth doesn't need rehearsal. So when a person resists a process that would theoretically confirm their innocence, it creates a contradiction worth examining. From a psychological standpoint, one explanation is cognitive dissonance. If part of the truth is inconvenient or damaging, then telling the whole truth without filters becomes a stressful proposition. The act of separation removes the safety net of CO validation, meaning each person has to navigate their own mental map of the story without backup. For someone who has even slightly altered their version of events, this can cause anxiety, often visible in speech patterns, body language, and recall hesitations. Philosophically, this raises the question of transparency as a moral posture versus transparency as a tactical decision. In an ideal moral framework, truth is given without manipulation, but in a tactical framework, truth is released strategically to minimize harm to the self. Resistance to separation aligns more with the latter because it controls timing and content delivery, reducing the risk of revealing uncoordinated details. There's also a legal undercurrent here. Wealthy individuals with immediate access to attorneys often operate with a heightened sense of rights assertion. They may genuinely believe that agreeing to separation opens the door to prosecutorial overreach. The irony is that this overprotectiveness can make them appear calculated, even when they might see themselves as merely being careful. From a criminological perspective, this becomes part of the behavioral evidence, not evidence in the forensic sense, but evidence of mindset and strategy. The refusal tells investigators something about the subject's perception of risk, even if the actual underlying facts remain unknown. In cases like this, the behavior often becomes part of the investigative theory itself, guiding future interviews and even influencing search warrant language. If we think about the physiological element, separation also introduces stress spikes. Without the other person present, your brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, may perceive the situation as riskier. This can push a person into fight or flight mode, which in turn increases the likelihood of making mistakes in their narrative. For someone with nothing to hide, that might not matter. But for someone carrying even a small deception, the fear of slipping up becomes amplified. And then there's the mind of the killer angle. For someone guilty, separation is a tactical threat. It's the moment when the chain of consistency is most vulnerable to breaking. A skilled interviewer can pick up on subtle discrepancies, and once those are identified, they can be cross-referenced against the other party's version. For someone trying to keep a lie intact, that's the crack in the armor. Finally, there's the public relations dimension. In high-profile cases, every choice is interpreted. Resistance to separation, even if legally sound, will be dissected by the media and the public. This is where how it looks can end up being as damaging as what it is, and where the psychology of image control overlaps with the mechanics of the investigation. Along the same lines, we also have to think about the possibility that the interviews themselves were shaped by pre-discussed strategies. This isn't uncommon. Attorneys often prep clients before interviews, but here, the concern is that the prep crossed into the territory of scripting responses, rehearsing talking points, and deciding in advance which avenues of discussion to shut down. This creates a subtle but important distinction between legal preparedness and coordinated narrative control. Technically speaking, this is where investigative psychology looks at statement analysis, examining how people phrase things, where they pause, and how they handle unexpected questions. Pre-discussed strategies often leave traces, repeated phrasing between parties, mirrored word choices, or identical emotional beats when describing key moments. In layman's terms, it's like hearing two students give separate answers to a test but both make the exact same oddly specific mistake. It suggests they studied together with the same flawed material. Philosophically, this touches on the tension between self-protection and truth-seeking. In an adversarial justice system, suspects are incentivized to protect themselves, but in doing so, they can also obscure the very information needed to resolve the case. This paradox, where protecting oneself can look like hiding something, is central to how such cases stall in the court of public opinion. There's also the forensic framing aspect. Once investigators suspect that statements are rehearsed, they begin to adjust their questioning style to destabilize the script. This could mean throwing in surprise questions, changing the order of topics, or revisiting a detail later in the interview to see if the answer shifts. From the outside, these techniques might look like harassment, but they're rooted in established interviewing methodology designed to pierce through coordination. On a physiological level, maintaining a rehearsed story under pressure consumes mental energy. The brain's prefrontal cortex has to work overtime to keep the script in place while filtering out intrusive, truthful memories. This is why you sometimes see micro-expressions or brief hesitations at unexpected moments, tiny lapses in the cognitive wall that give away rehearsed material. If we step inside the mind of a killer who is participating in such a strategy, the calculation is different. They're not just trying to remember the truth. They're managing multiple layers of information, the actual events, the agreed upon version, and the real-time adjustments needed when the interviewer goes off script. This juggling act is risky, and every second in the chair feels like walking a tightrope. From a criminological perspective, these pre-discussed strategies also influence the trajectory of the case. They slow the pace of information gathering, frustrate investigators, and sometimes force reliance on physical evidence over testimonial evidence. While this can protect a guilty party, it can also, ironically, protect an innocent person who simply doesn't trust the system. And ultimately, the blending of legal rights, strategic communication, and emotional self-preservation creates a complicated picture. Whether those pre-discussed elements were a shield for the innocent or a mask for the guilty is the question investigators and the public end up wrestling with long after the interviews are over. 3. Discussions about suspects and theories. The Ramseys consistently presented a unified front regarding their belief in an intruder. In Patsy's June 1998 interview, she unequivocally stated, "He and I both know there was someone else in the house that night." This shared conviction formed the basis of their theories and discussions about potential suspects. Patsy further confirmed that she and John had discussed the various theories about the crime over and over and over. Their discussions extended to specific individuals. Both John and Patsy voiced suspicions about Fleet and Priscilla White, who were close friends. John described extremely bizarre behavior on their part after JonBenet's death, including an incident where John Fernie wouldn't let Fleet on the airplane because he thought he was too out of control. Patsy corroborated this, recalling Fleet's erratic behavior and his unusual detailed knowledge of the ransom note structure, which seemed unusual to me. Patsy also mentioned an incident where Fleet White demanded to let the Steins see us at Father Roll's office. They also discussed other individuals as potential suspects. Patsy stated that early on, we provided a list to the police of people who could be angry with you all or, had a reason or who had access to their home, and that John mentioned Mr. Merrick among that list. John similarly recalled that Patsy had told him there is one other person out there that knows this killer after Pam received a call from a woman in Greeley who identified Mervyn Peters or Irwin, the molester. John mentioned they debated whether we should call the police about this lead. John also brought up their initial suspicion of Bill M.C. Reynolds, sharing an anecdote about him pushing Patsy away at the memorial service and how he fit John Douglas's profile of a suspect. Their consistent and strong denials of their own and Burke's involvement were a cornerstone of their shared narrative. John declared in his 1998 interview, "I have never, ever had that thought about Patsy or Burke." Patsy, likewise, vehemently denied Burke's culpability, stating, "No, it wouldn't have been Burke, my child, it is unheard of." This mutual and unwavering defense of each other and their son strongly indicates a shared understanding and consistent messaging about their innocence. These instances, some explicitly stated and others inferred from aligning accounts, demonstrate that John and Patsy Ramsey were indeed deeply engaged in ongoing discussions about the unfolding investigation, its evidence, and the various theories and suspects, collectively navigating the traumatic events that had befallen their family. Okay, so let's first think about this dynamic where Patsy completely shuts down any inquiry into Burke, almost as if the topic itself is off limits not just emotionally, but strategically. In many criminal investigations, especially those involving family members, there's an instinctive protective reflex. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning, where information that threatens one's worldview or relationships is dismissed, while less threatening narratives are entertained or even encouraged. Here, though, it's not just a mother defending her son. It's the scale and force of the redirection toward others that stands out. The leap from "don't ask about Burke" to "use your resources to look into this remote stranger" feels like more than just emotional shielding. It carries elements of narrative steering. If we think about this in terms of criminology, there's a concept called suspect displacement, where attention is moved away from a plausible subject and toward alternative targets, sometimes with minimal evidentiary grounding. Patsy's insistence on exploring shoestring connections fits that mold, especially when those connections are, by the account, flimsy. From a law enforcement standpoint, this kind of steering can fracture resource allocation, pulling investigators toward dead ends while primary avenues remain underexplored. And in the psychological sense, this deflection can also serve to reinforce a public-facing innocence narrative. The more you talk about others, the less the spotlight is on your own home. What's also interesting is the imbalance in evidentiary thresholds. With Burke, the standard seems impossibly high. You can't even question him without overwhelming proof. With outsiders, the threshold is practically non-existent. The mere mention of a connection, however tenuous, is enough to warrant aggressive pursuit. This asymmetry is revealing because it suggests an internal hierarchy of credibility, not based on investigative best practice, but on personal stake. In a technical sense, that's the inversion of Occam's razor. Instead of prioritizing the simplest and most probable explanation, it prioritizes the most distant and convoluted. Another angle worth noting is how this posture plays in the court of public opinion. In high-profile cases, perception often matters as much as facts. By pushing law enforcement toward unrelated persons, Patsy effectively feeds the public new narratives to latch onto, creating a rotating villain phenomenon where attention shifts so quickly that the original line of inquiry becomes blurred or forgotten. In forensic framing, this is a soft form of misdirection strategy where you don't just deny allegations, you actively build alternative scenarios to compete with the official one. From a physiological perspective, when a person is under extreme stress, especially the stress of being under suspicion, the brain's limbic system can drive fight or flight responses that manifest in communication. The fight response here is subtle. It's not shouting or aggression, but persistent argumentative redirection. By constantly offering new outside targets, Patsy is essentially creating an escape hatch in the conversation, letting the amygdala's need for self-preservation translate into a tactical narrative defense. Philosophically, this behavior raises questions about moral consistency. If the pursuit of justice is truly the priority, then investigative scrutiny should be applied evenly. Yet, what we see here is justice being conditional, worth pursuing in some directions but resisted in others. That double standard may not prove guilt in itself, but it aligns with patterns seen in cases where individuals have insider knowledge they don't wish to see exposed. The deeper you think about it, the more it resembles a controlled theater where certain acts are allowed and others are forbidden. And then there's the killer's perspective. If the perpetrator was within the home, this kind of protective resistance is exactly the shield they'd hope for. The more fiercely the household gatekeepers defend one member, the more oxygen is given to alternative theories, buying time and diluting investigative focus. A killer in this environment wouldn't need to craft complex alibis, they'd simply have to let the guardians of the narrative do the heavy lifting. All of this brings us to the larger implication. This isn't just a personal reaction from Patsy, it's a functional tactic in the broader landscape of suspect management. Whether consciously or instinctively, her strong defense of Burke paired with the overzealous targeting of outsiders creates a funnel where suspicion is perpetually redirected outward. In practical, investigative terms, that's not just emotional behavior, it's a structural barrier to truth-finding, and we can continue to think about the physical and testimonial evidence that complicates the Ramsey narrative. This is where the contradictions stack up, and in a forensic context, contradictions are gold. They're the stress points in a story where truth and fabrication collide. When you have multiple witnesses from the same household giving mutually exclusive accounts, like Burke saying he got up in the night versus John insisting he stayed asleep, you have what's known in investigative psychology as intra-group inconsistency. This is more damaging than inconsistencies between unrelated witnesses because those in close proximity are expected to have aligned experiences. Now, the forensic elements make this even more compelling. Fingerprints of Patsy and Burke on the pineapple bowl and tea glass may sound trivial at first, but in context they become highly relevant. If those items were part of a timeline-critical moment before the murder, their presence connects these individuals physically to objects in the scene. Add in fibers from Patsy and John found at the crime scene and DNA from Burke and Patsy on JonBenet's clothing, and the physical evidence matrix starts to anchor suspicion inward rather than outward. This is where forensic science and deductive reasoning converge. You're not just matching patterns, you're weighing plausibility based on proximity and access. It's also telling when the narrative around these items shifts. For example, the bat, first denied as belonging to the household, then later acknowledged by Burke, presents a classic statement reversal, which in forensic interviewing is a red flag. People under truthful recall tend to maintain their story, even if they forget minor details. Shifting on a material fact like object ownership suggests either prior misinformation or an evolving defensive strategy. And from a layman's standpoint, if you had nothing to hide, why not just say from the start that it was your bat? Contradictions about morning routines also matter. Patsy claiming she didn't go into Burke's room while Burke says she did may seem small, but in a criminal timeline, small moments determine alibi integrity. Every gap or overlap in these statements becomes an opportunity to reassess motive, means, and opportunity. Philosophically, it's about the coherence principle. Truth is naturally self-consistent over time, while lies require constant adjustment to stay aligned. From a criminological perspective, when you see evidence like this, you begin to apply linkage analysis, where physical and behavioral evidence is connected to create a comprehensive suspect profile. Here, the linkages keep circling back to the household, not away from it. That doesn't automatically exclude outsiders, but it does mean that the highest yield investigative return is likely inside the initial crime scene perimeter. Inside the mind of a killer, these contradictions would be a double-edged sword. On one hand, they can create confusion that slows down an investigation. On the other, they increase the risk of exposure if law enforcement is persistent. A perpetrator who's part of the household would be highly invested in keeping stories loosely coordinated but flexible enough to adjust when contradictions are exposed, a kind of narrative damage control. And in forensic framing, the more contradictions emerge, the more the investigator's cognitive load increases. This is important because overloaded investigators are more likely to miss subtle links or let certain inconsistencies slide. A skilled manipulator in this position doesn't have to win the truth game, they just have to make it so complex and internally contradictory that the official narrative remains unresolved. The bottom line is, when physical evidence and testimonial inconsistencies line up against the household, the logical move is to prioritize that household for deeper scrutiny. The fact that this case persistently shifted away from that focus is itself a form of forensic anomaly, something worth investigating in its own right. Along the same lines, we can also think about how John and Patsy appear to manage the flow of information between themselves, almost as if they're controlling the bandwidth of each other's testimony. The pattern suggested here, John being the central holder of suspect knowledge and selectively feeding Patsy just enough to answer without detail, is a textbook example of controlled disclosure. In law enforcement, this is often seen in organized criminal operations, where different members hold only partial information to limit exposure under questioning. This selective priming has a psychological advantage. It keeps the person being questioned from overextending themselves into areas where they might contradict known facts. If Patsy can honestly say, "I've heard of that person but don't know the details," she appears both truthful and cooperative, while still maintaining the integrity of the household's internal narrative. From a layman's angle, it's like prepping a friend before a meeting. If they ask about this, just say you've heard of it. The criminological implication here is that such a strategy can be used to keep multiple narratives superficially aligned without requiring all participants to carry the same level of detail. It's a way to maintain plausible deniability while still pushing a coordinated theory. Philosophically, this flirts with the concept of truth management, where truth is not a fixed reality to be uncovered, but a resource to be curated and distributed for strategic effect. From the perspective of forensic interviewing, this creates a challenge. The goal of separating witnesses is to prevent precisely this kind of cross-contamination of testimony. If John and Patsy were able to anticipate questions and align partial answers beforehand, it would undermine the separation's intended value. This is where pre-interview briefing, a concept well known in criminal enterprises, comes into play. It's not just about agreeing on lies, it's about agreeing on the boundaries of what each person will and won't say. Inside the mind of the killer, this arrangement is golden. If the killer is one of them, then as long as the household sticks to the priming strategy, the investigation can be held at bay. The killer's identity becomes almost secondary to the household's collective defense strategy. The family unit becomes the firewall. And that firewall is reinforced every time a prepared, limited answer passes for full cooperation. From a physiological stress standpoint, limiting the scope of one's answers also reduces cognitive load. Lying is mentally taxing because it requires suppressing the truth, fabricating a falsehood, and maintaining consistency across retellings. By narrowing the field of permissible responses, the household reduces the risk of memory errors and slip-ups, making the deception more sustainable over time. There's also an emotional undertone here worth noting. By controlling what Patsy knows, John can play both the role of protector and strategist, giving her just enough to function in the legal arena without exposing her to the full burden of possible guilt. This could preserve internal harmony while still serving external defense needs. And if we look at this through the lens of forensic framing, it's another way of keeping the investigation's gaze pointed outward rather than inward. Ultimately, the pattern of selective knowledge sharing, when combined with strong outward deflection and internal contradictions, paints a picture not of randomness, but of structure. And in investigations, structure, especially in the form of coordinated storytelling, is rarely accidental. Okay, let's discuss a few things a little further that we've talked about thus far, because when you start piecing all of these threads together, you start to see patterns that aren't just coincidental. They have structure, rhythm, and a kind of calculated feel to them. One of the biggest points that jumps out is the way Patsy draws this hard, immovable line around Burke. Any question that even brushes against the idea of his involvement gets met with this fierce, almost visceral rejection. Now, sure, you could argue that's just a mother's instinct, but here's the thing. Her willingness to redirect those same investigative energies towards strangers with almost no real connection to the case, tells us something about selectivity. In layman's terms, it's like saying, don't you dare check my yard for missing apples, but feel free to search that guy's place 3 towns over because he once walked past an orchard. When we dig into this selectivity, what's interesting is how it reflects a concept criminologists sometimes call suspect displacement. Instead of saying, I don't know who did this, the focus is shifted onto people who are so far removed from the core facts that their connection is almost laughable. Now, if you're genuinely after truth, this kind of shotgun approach doesn't make sense. But if your goal is to buy time, drain resources, and keep investigators preoccupied, then pushing them toward shoestring connections is almost a defensive strategy in itself. And if you're a killer sitting in that house, that's music to your ears. You don't even have to work to protect yourself because the people closest to you are already doing it. Another piece that deserves closer attention is the imbalance in evidentiary thresholds. For Burke, it's like the standard is set at an Olympic level. Ironclad proof is required before you can even ask a question. But for these random outsiders, the bar is on the floor. Just the hint of a whisper is enough to greenlight a full-blown investigation. This isn't just emotional favoritism, it's a reversal of how sound investigative reasoning works. Normally, you'd start close to home where access, opportunity, and motive are most likely, and then branch out. Here, it's the exact opposite, which in layman's terms is like looking for your missing wallet by searching strangers' houses before you bother checking your own living room. Now, shifting gears to the contradictions, this is where things really start to get tangled. In forensic work, contradictions are like flashing neon signs. You've got John saying Burke stayed asleep all night, but Burke says he got up. Patsy says she didn't go into Burke's room that morning, but Burke says she did. These aren't small memory lapses, they're mutually exclusive realities. And here's the kicker. These contradictions don't happen between unrelated people. They happen within a tightly knit family unit that lived under the same roof, in the same space during the same critical hours. That raises the stakes because in normal life, shared events tend to produce aligned memories unless something is being intentionally restructured. And then there's the physical evidence. Fingerprints of Patsy and Burke on the pineapple bowl and tea glass may sound like a mundane kitchen detail until you realize how critical those items are to the timeline. If that pineapple was eaten shortly before JonBenet was attacked, those prints aren't just household clutter. They're timestamp markers. Throw in fibers from Patsy and John at the crime scene, and DNA linked to Burke and Patsy on her clothing, and the evidence web starts shrinking inward. From a technical standpoint, this is where linkage analysis comes into play, where you start connecting who touched what, when, and in what context. In plain language, it's like playing connect the dots, but the picture keeps coming back to the same household. One moment that sticks out is the bat. First, it's denied, oh no, that's not ours, and then later it's admitted to be Burke's. That's a textbook example of what interview experts call a statement reversal. People who are telling the truth tend to stick to their original account, even if they have small gaps in memory. Changing the story on something as simple as whose bat is this isn't just a slip. It's an indicator that the first answer served a defensive purpose that later had to be abandoned when contradictory facts emerged. And for a killer inside the home, every shift like this is a risk because each reversal creates a paper trail of inconsistency. On top of that, we've got this priming dynamic between John and Patsy. It's as if John is the main holder of certain information, and he drip feeds it to Patsy so she can answer without actually knowing much detail. That's what law enforcement might call controlled disclosure. Keep the other person's knowledge just broad enough to look cooperative, but shallow enough to avoid getting trapped in specifics. In a criminal enterprise, this is a smart tactic. In a household under murder suspicion, it's downright strategic. And in layman's terms, it's like telling someone before a meeting, if they ask about the guy in the blue car, just say you've heard of him, nothing more. The value of this kind of priming is that it keeps stories loosely aligned without requiring perfect memorization. Lies are hard to maintain because they take mental energy. Lying isn't just making something up, it's keeping it consistent across time and questioning. By narrowing the range of what you can say, you lower the cognitive load, making the deception more sustainable. This is basic neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex works overtime when you're fabricating, but give it fewer variables to manage and you reduce the risk of slipping. Now, thinking about the physiological side, stress responses play a role too. Under threat, the limbic system drives us into fight or flight. In Patsy's case, the fight is subtle. It's not yelling or storming out. It's the relentless redirection toward outsiders. This is a survival tactic, but in a legal setting, it doubles as a misdirection tactic. A killer within the house could rely on that kind of behavior to keep the heat off themselves without having to actively intervene. What's also worth noting is how these contradictions and defensive maneuvers can wear investigators down. The more tangled the web becomes, the more mental energy it takes to track each discrepancy. Investigators, like anyone else, have cognitive limits. When you flood the case with side theories, half-truths, and shifting accounts, you raise the risk that key inconsistencies will get lost in the noise. This is one of the subtler weapons in forensic framing. You don't have to prove your innocence. You just have to make proving your guilt exhausting. From a philosophical standpoint, all of this raises questions about the pursuit of truth versus the preservation of self. If truth was the only goal, then the same standards of scrutiny would be applied to everyone. But here, justice seems conditional, worth pursuing aggressively in some directions, but gently sidestepped in others. This conditionality is exactly what makes some investigators suspect deeper insider involvement. And in layman's terms, it's like a game where the rules change depending on who's playing. Inside the mind of a killer in this environment, the calculation is simple. Keep the household united, keep the storylines controlled, and let outsiders absorb the bulk of investigative energy. If you can maintain that equilibrium, you drastically reduce your risk of exposure. And the more time passes, the more memories fade, evidence degrades, and public attention shifts elsewhere. Time isn't just a healer, it's a defense strategy. We also have to think about how narrative control plays into public perception. In high-profile cases, public opinion can shape investigative direction. By seeding the public with other suspects' names, the Ramseys could have been reinforcing their innocence narrative in the media while investigators chased cold trails. In technical terms, this is a competing narrative strategy. You don't have to disprove the primary theory if you can get people to believe in multiple plausible alternatives. And looping back to the evidence, what's funny is that so much of it isn't dramatic or exotic. It's everyday items like bowls, glasses, and bats. But in forensic science, the mundane often carries the biggest weight. That's because household items are tied directly to access. If a stranger had used that pineapple bowl, the fingerprint evidence would have been even more damning than it is now. But when it's household members' prints, the context shifts. It's not just who touched it, it's when and why. In the end, when you combine the selective protection of Burke, the overzealous targeting of outsiders, the contradictions in testimony, the physical evidence pointing inward, and the apparent priming between John and Patsy, you don't just have random noise, you have a system. And systems in criminology are rarely accidental. They're the product of either conscious planning or instinctive self-preservation that happens to function like a plan. Either way, the effect is the same. The investigation gets pushed off its most promising track and into the weeds. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. You don't need to stage elaborate false evidence or orchestrate movie-style cover-ups to shield a killer. Sometimes all you need is a tight-knit group willing to guard certain members fiercely, feed investigators alternative paths, and keep their own stories just fuzzy enough to avoid a direct hit. Over time, that can be as effective as any deliberate cover-up, and maybe even harder to untangle. Now, coming out of that final point, it's worth taking a step back and asking what all of this really leaves us with. When you combine selective shielding of Burke, redirection toward outsiders, contradictory statements from John, Patsy, and Burke, and physical evidence that keeps circling back to the home, you're not just looking at coincidence. You're looking at a structured pattern of influence over the investigative process. That's the kind of pattern that doesn't have to be perfect to be effective. It just has to keep law enforcement from getting a clean shot at the truth. And if you think about it, that's where the genius, or at least the functionality of this setup lies. You don't have to prove anything false outright. You just have to make the truth harder to prove. You create a maze where every promising path forks off into dead ends, side trails, or unproductive detours. And what's funny about that is it can look, on the surface, like cooperation. Names are given, leads are suggested, but in practice, it's cooperation that quietly serves self-preservation. We also have to remember that in high-profile cases like this, public perception becomes its own layer of defense. When the public is fed alternative suspects, even the most implausible ones, it fragments opinion and diffuses pressure. The longer that public confusion holds, the more time passes, and the harder it becomes for any investigation to land a decisive blow. That's not just a legal tactic, that's a psychological one. What might be worth noting too is that the combination of emotional protection, legal maneuvering, and forensic counterweighting creates a kind of investigative stalemate. No one is saying this family had to be master strategists to pull that off. Sometimes these systems build themselves when enough self-interest and fear are in play. But from the outside looking in, the effect is almost indistinguishable from a deliberate strategy. So in closing, whether you see this as instinctive reaction, calculated manipulation, or a blend of both, the result is the same. The case gets pushed off its most probable path, and the people most worth questioning are the ones who end up sitting behind the thickest walls of protection. And that's the kind of outcome that makes you wonder, not just about guilt or innocence, but about how much truth can really survive once the people closest to it start shaping the story. And with that being said, as always, I appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe if you haven't. And until next time, take care of yourself.